Traore versus Israel, an explosive Middle East twist, a move that not only shocked Africa, but sent tremors across every diplomatic capital in the world. This is no ordinary headline. This is the story of a young African soldier who dared to step into the very heart of the most impossible conflict on earth, the Israeli-Palestinian war, and walked out with an agreement that experts swore could never be signed. Welcome back to Vision of Traoré, your fearless source for diplomatic bombshells and geopolitical truths that shake the global order. Drop your country in the comments because what you're about to hear is history being rewritten, not by Washington, not by Brussels, not even by Moscow or Beijing, but by Ouagadougou. May 2025, the month that positioned Captain Ibrahim Traoré, at just 37 years old, as Africa's most influential diplomatic voice on the world stage. A man who carried no empire behind him, no centuries of colonial baggage, no global superpower's arsenal, just his convictions, his scars from the Sahel, and the moral weight of a continent that has endured foreign violence for generations. While seasoned diplomats with decades of experience failed, Traoré did the unthinkable. He forced Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority to sit at the same table in Amman, Jordan. And there, under African mediation, they signed a ceasefire that has held for more than 4 months, the longest stretch of calm in the region in over a decade. This was not just politics. This was not just negotiation. This was an African leader raising his voice and demanding that the world listen, that Africa, long ignored, would no longer be silent. Stay with me, because in the next part, I will reveal how Traoré dared to insert Africa into the Middle East, why the West panicked, and what secret strategy he used to achieve the impossible. The world has watched the Middle East burn for generations. Israel and Palestine locked in endless cycles of war, ceasefire, and betrayal. Western diplomats fly in and out with promises that collapse within weeks. United Nations resolutions pile up like dust in forgotten archives. Every U.S. president since Carter has tried to mediate. Every European leader has offered their framework. And yet, the blood continues to soak the soil of Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. For decades, Africa was excluded from these talks. Western powers, dripping with their own colonial arrogance, acted as though only they held the keys to peace. But the truth is, every so-called peace plan carried invisible baggage: oil pipelines, arms deals, intelligence alliances, and geopolitical chess moves. None were truly neutral. None could win the trust of both sides. And that is where Ibrahim Traoré saw the opening. The audacious declaration, May 15, 2025, standing in Ouagadougou, not in Washington or Paris. Traoré declared what the world thought was impossible. Burkina Faso would host Middle East peace negotiations. His voice thundered across African airwaves. The conflict has raged for decades. The world's most powerful nations have failed to bring peace. It is time for Africa to show what true leadership looks like. We, who have suffered foreign interference and colonial violence, understand both the pain of the oppressed and the fear of the besieged. It was a statement that cut like a blade through diplomatic silence. Israel's foreign ministry mocked it as naive African posturing. Palestinian authorities, weary of decades of broken promises, cautiously welcomed it. Any serious initiative deserves attention. The U.S. State Department warned against unauthorized diplomatic interventions, while the European Union dismissed the idea, questioning whether Africa could handle such a task. But behind the scenes, Traoré was not bluffing. Intelligence reports later revealed his calculation was precise. Africa's moral authority. Unlike Europe or the U.S., Africa carried no colonial legacy in the Middle East. Personal credibility. Traoré himself had fought terrorists in the Sahel, giving him first-hand understanding of fear, loss, and resilience. International partnerships. Russia and China quietly backed his vision, ready to provide diplomatic cover. Economic leverage. Africa's uranium and gold reserves gave it bargaining power few recognized. Dr. Amara Sankara, professor of international relations at the University of Ouagadougou, summarized it best. Traoré understood what no one else did. The Middle East didn't need more Western formulas. It needed fresh voices, untainted, courageous, and grounded in real suffering. What many dismissed as a stunt quickly evolved into a movement. In the weeks after his announcement, African newspapers hailed Traoré's plan as a rebirth of African diplomacy. Social media across the continent lit up with hashtags like #Africa the Mediator. For the first time, ordinary Africans saw their leader not just resisting neo-colonialism at home, but stepping onto the world stage as a peacemaker. Western governments underestimated how much this mattered. To Palestinians, here was a leader who understood the language of the oppressed. To Israelis, here was a man who had fought extremism and still spoke of dialogue. To Africans, here was proof that their continent was not a pawn, but a player. 2 weeks of relentless behind-the-scenes talks followed, and then it happened. Both Israeli and Palestinian delegations agreed to preliminary talks in Amman, Jordan. The terms were radical in their simplicity. African Union as neutral moderator. No preconditions for the first meeting. Immediate focus on humanitarian ceasefire. Guarantees from Russia and China to ensure fairness. It was, as one European diplomat grudgingly admitted, a formula no Western leader could have sold without suspicion. But coming from Africa, it was accepted. This was the foundation. A continent dismissed as too weak, too divided, had stepped into one of the fiercest conflicts on Earth, and the door was opening. June 2, 2025. Inside a heavily guarded conference room in Amman, Jordan, history began to unfold. The world's most intractable conflict was about to face a mediator no one expected, a young African soldier president with the audacity to believe that wisdom could outweigh firepower. For 15 days, Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned the rigid script of Western diplomacy upside down. Instead of sterile speeches and endless procedural arguments, he began with something shockingly human. Traoré opened not with political points, but with pain. He spoke of Burkina Faso's villages ravaged by terrorism. He described mothers burying their sons, fathers standing over shattered homes, children silenced before they could speak their first words. His voice broke as he declared, "This pain knows no nationality, no religion, no politics. Palestinian mothers' tears are no different from Israeli mothers' tears. Your children's blood is the same red as Burkina children's blood." The room fell silent. Delegates who had spent years locked in hardened positions suddenly heard something unfamiliar, empathy without agenda. Traoré forced both delegations into the same room, but not to debate. Instead, he asked them to share their traumas without interruption. Israeli officials recounted suicide bombings and rocket fire. Palestinians told of home demolitions, checkpoints, and children growing up under occupation. No rebuttals, no shouting, just listening. A Palestinian delegate later admitted, "For the first time in years, someone understood our pain without trying to weaponize it." An Israeli negotiator, shocked by his own emotions, confessed his moral authority came from his own scars. He spoke as someone who had lived the terror, not from behind a polished podium. After emotional barriers began to crack, Traoré shifted gears. He focused on immediate humanitarian needs, medical corridors, food supplies, rebuilding schools. He brought in African engineers and aid experts who laid out practical plans. This wasn't abstract diplomacy. This was survival delivered with African hands. The final stretch was brutal. Delegates clashed over timelines, security guarantees, and the role of international monitors. Western diplomats scoffed from the sidelines, predicting collapse. But Traoré leaned on his unorthodox coalition, Russia and China providing international legitimacy, African Union promising neutral oversight, and his own relentless insistence that this was not about politics, but about children's lives. The turning point came on day 14. As talks seemed on the verge of failure, Traoré stood up and told a story he had never shared publicly. He spoke of holding the hand of a dying child in the Sahel, his small chest pierced by a terrorist's bullet. He remembered the weight of that silence, heavier than any battlefield victory. That boy was not Burkinabe, not Muslim, not Christian. He was a child, and I swore his death would not be in vain. If we cannot end war for our children, then what kind of leaders are we? The room cracked. Tears welled up. Palestinian and Israeli negotiators who had spent decades hating each other suddenly found themselves united, not by politics, but by grief. Against all odds, the signatures were placed on paper. A 14-day ceasefire, humanitarian corridors monitored by African Union peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges supervised by neutral African mediators, and international monitoring guaranteed by Russia, China, and Africa. It was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. And yet it was real. Western media called it the miracle of Amman. In Gaza, guns fell silent. In Tel Aviv, families dared to sleep without sirens. For the first time in over a decade, hope lasted longer than a headline. But as Traoré would soon discover, hope is dangerous, and those who profit from endless war were already preparing to strike back. Barely 5 days after the signing of the Amman Accords, a storm began brewing in Western intelligence circles. Classified cables later revealed a chilling assessment from Washington. If Traoré's mediation holds, Africa becomes an uncontrollable diplomatic power. Neutralize it. The United States, France, and Britain had long dominated the language of peace talks, turning them into instruments of influence. Traoré's sudden success threatened to shatter decades of carefully built control. He had exposed the impotence of traditional powers, and worse, he had done it with the backing of Russia and China. June 20, 2025, leaked intelligence documents unveiled a coordinated sabotage effort involving the CIA, France's DGSE, and Britain's MI6. The CIA allocated $23 million for disinformation campaigns portraying Traoré as an Iranian puppet. Fake news spread across global outlets, framing his mediation as dangerous and illegitimate. France's DGSE funneled €18 million to undermine African credibility. They pressured Francophone governments to publicly question Traoré's mandate, while covertly supporting African opposition figures to denounce him as a military overreach. Britain's MI6 spent £12 million lobbying the EU to dismiss the Amman Accords as symbolic theatrics. They also launched financial probes into Burkina Faso's gold exports, hoping to choke funding for peacekeeping. It was a full-spectrum assault: media, money, and political pressure. The message was clear: the West would not tolerate African leadership in the Middle East. Then came the violence. June 25, Tel Aviv. As Traoré's convoy left a secure compound, sniper fire tore through the desert night. Lieutenant Cabaret, Traoré's most trusted aide, was killed instantly. Traoré himself was wounded in the shoulder but survived. Forensic teams later confirmed the rifles used were Western-manufactured, precision-grade, the kind reserved for elite special forces. The convoy route, it turned out, was information accessible only to a handful of Allied intelligence agencies. The world was horrified. Palestinian officials condemned the attack, calling it proof that peace is feared more than war. Israeli officials, unusually, issued a rare statement of sympathy. In Africa exploded with outrage. Traoré, wounded but unbowed, addressed the press from his hospital bed in Amman. His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold. Those words ignited something bigger than any bullet could silence. Instead of collapsing, the peace process hardened. Russia and China doubled security around Traoré. The African Union called an emergency session, unanimously passing a resolution to support the Amman Accords. Even skeptical leaders like Nigeria's political elite and Egypt's cautious diplomats rallied behind him. For the first time, Israel and Palestine jointly condemned an act of sabotage. They may not have trusted each other fully, but they trusted the African mediator who had risked his life for their children's safety. July 15, 2025. When Traoré finally returned home, more than 2.3 million people filled the streets of Ouagadougou. Palestinian and Israeli flags waved beside Burkina Faso's colors. Delegations from 34 African nations joined the celebration. Youths chanted in dozens of languages, "Africa, the Peacemaker." Continental reverberations. The ripple effect across Africa was immediate. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa declared, "We are no longer beggars for Western solutions. Africa provides its own wisdom." Kenya's Uhuru Kenyatta added, "This young man has shown that Africa can solve the world's problems if given the chance and the respect." The African Union chairperson Moussa Faki went further. The Amman Accords marked the dawn of Africa's diplomatic leadership. Momentum did not stop at symbolism. Within weeks, the African Union announced the creation of the African Peace Institute in Ouagadougou, a training ground for mediators, conflict resolution researchers, and peacekeepers. It was the first institution of its kind, designed to export African methods of diplomacy to the world. Soon, requests began to pour in. Ethiopia and Eritrea asked for Burkinabe involvement in their border disputes. Mali and Algeria invited Traoré to oversee negotiations over Saharan security corridors. Chad and Sudan looked to African Union mediators trained in the Traoré method. Analysts began dissecting why Traoré had succeeded where the West had failed. African scholars pointed to tradition. June 25, 2025, Tel Aviv. Traoré's convoy moved through narrow streets, headlights cutting through the desert haze. Then, cracks of sniper fire ripped the silence. Windows shattered. Tires screeched. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Lieutenant Traoré's loyal aide and lifelong comrade, slumped lifelessly in the armored vehicle. Traoré himself, struck in the shoulder, was pulled down by his guards. Panic should have reigned, but instead, his voice, calm, commanding, cut through the chaos. "Keep moving. This peace will not die tonight." Those words transformed what could have been tragedy into legend. The world now saw not just a negotiator, but a man willing to bleed for peace. Imagine it, a lone African leader, wounded yet unbowed, standing against faceless Western agencies, armed with billions of dollars, satellites, and elite operatives. The scene could have been torn from a Hollywood script. But this was no fiction, it was Africa's reality. Western media scrambled to spin the story. Some outlets painted Traoré as reckless, a soldier out of his depth. But the images told another truth, a young African president, bandaged and defiant, declaring in front of cameras, "You can silence voices, but you cannot silence Africa." This was the climax, the point where the balance tipped. Instead of breaking him, the assassination attempt forged him into a myth. Across Gaza, murals appeared of Traoré shaking hands with Palestinian children. In Tel Aviv, an Israeli mother held up a sign, "Let him live. He speaks for our dead too." The West had fired bullets, but they had missed their target. Because Traoré's real power was not his body, but the idea he embodied, Africa as peacemaker, Africa as equal. When he returned to Ouagadougou, the streets exploded in thunderous celebration. The chants were not just for a president, but for a symbol. Africa can heal the world. Traoré is our Mandela. The climax had arrived, and Africa had seized the spotlight. June 2025 is no longer just a date on the calendar. It is a marker of history, the kind that divides eras into before and after. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been the stage where the greatest powers flexed their influence. American presidents made promises. European leaders drafted endless frameworks. UN resolutions collected dust in forgotten files. Each attempt came wrapped in the language of peace, but bound tightly by the chains of politics, oil, arms, and influence. And still, the rockets flew, the bombs fell, the children wept. Then came something no one predicted. From the heart of West Africa, from a land dismissed as peripheral, emerged a soldier president who carried neither an empire's army nor a superpower's treasury. He carried scars. He carried conviction. And he carried the moral authority of a continent that has endured centuries of foreign meddling, yet still believes in the power of healing. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's announcement in May 2025 was mocked, dismissed, even ridiculed. Israel's foreign ministry sneered. Washington called it dangerous. Europe shook its head in doubt. But Palestine's weary voices listened, and Africa's youth roared in support. Because, at last, someone dared to say what no one else would. It is time for Africa to lead. A ceasefire, written in blood and courage. What followed in Amman was not simply diplomacy. It was transformation. In 15 days, Traoré replaced negotiation tables with storytelling circles. He forced adversaries to listen, not argue. He placed children's lives above political talking points. And when bullets tried to silence him, when his convoy was ambushed and his closest aide was killed, he stood wounded, yet unbroken, and declared, "His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." Those words echoed louder than any gunfire. They turned a fragile agreement into a movement. They made the Amman Accords not just ink on paper, but a symbol of defiance against war itself. 4 months later, the silence of guns in Gaza and the calm in Tel Aviv testified to something extraordinary. Africa's diplomacy works. Africa at the global table. But what does this mean beyond Israel and Palestine? For centuries, Africa has been treated as an object of diplomacy, not an actor. Decisions about Africa were made in Paris, London, Washington. Conflicts in Africa became laboratories for foreign experiments. Leaders were summoned to summits in European capitals, only to be lectured on governance, development, and peace. Now the script has flipped. The Amman Accords forced the world to acknowledge Africa not as a problem, but as a solution. Suddenly, Africa is not begging for mediation, it is exporting it. Ukraine whispers about African involvement. Ethiopia and Eritrea seek African wisdom. Sudan and Chad look to Ouagadougou for guidance. The demand is no longer for Western blueprints, but for African methods, Ubuntu, palaver, ancestral wisdom, community healing. This is seismic. It means Africa no longer needs to wait for a seat at the global table. It can build its own table, and others will come to sit. But such change does not come without enemies. Western intelligence agencies spent millions trying to sabotage the peace process. Disinformation campaigns branded Traoré as a pawn of Iran, as a reckless general, as a dangerous populist. European diplomats pressured Jordan to withdraw hosting support. British intelligence tried to choke Burkina Faso's financial pipelines, and when these failed, snipers struck. Yet each attempt backfired. Instead of weakening Traoré, they elevated him. Instead of delegitimizing Africa, they exposed the desperation of old empires clinging to fading relevance. The West, for the first time, was forced to defend its own failure, while Africa's success stood undeniable. The assassination attempt intended to silence only amplified. The blood spilled that night in Tel Aviv became the ink with which Africa signed its place in global history. The scenes in Ouagadougou on July 15th were unlike anything Africa had seen in generations. 2 million people on the streets, Israeli and Palestinian flags flown by African hands, delegations from across the continent standing shoulder to shoulder, chanting in unison, "Africa, the Peacemaker." It was more than a homecoming. It was a coronation, not of a king, but of an idea. The idea that Africa's time has come. The idea that leadership is not about military might or financial clout, but about moral clarity and courage. International media had no choice but to echo the truth. CNN, Al Jazeera, even skeptical European channels spoke of Africa's Mandela. Nobel committees whispered about nominations. Universities rushed to study the Traoré method. For the first time, African conflict resolution was not folklore, it was curriculum. The African Union's swift creation of the African Peace Institute in Ouagadougou marked the institutionalization of this moment. This was not to be a one-time miracle, it was to become a model. Training programs for mediators, research centers for conflict psychology, networks of peace practitioners. Africa was building an infrastructure of diplomacy that could rival any Western think tank. And the implications stretch far beyond the Middle East. If Africa can resolve the most stubborn conflict in modern history, what can it not do? Could it bridge Ukraine and Russia? Could it ease tensions in East Africa? Could it even bring new life to broken UN processes? The possibilities are staggering, and that is why the resistance will be fierce. Traoré's rise is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a battle for the soul of global diplomacy. Will the world allow Africa's voice to shape peace? Or will old powers deploy every tool, money, media, sabotage to bury it? The truth is, nothing guarantees that the Amman Accords will survive another year. Nothing guarantees that Traoré himself will survive the threats against him. But something far more important has already been achieved. The imagination of millions has been awakened. Young Africans now believe they can lead beyond their borders. Palestinians and Israelis now know that empathy can come from unexpected places. And the world now recognizes that Africa is not just rising, it is reshaping the order. And so, the story returns to you. This is not just about leaders and governments. It is about voices. About whether we, as a global community, are willing to recognize Africa's wisdom and courage. Do you believe that the Amman Accords are the dawn of a true African diplomatic era? Do you believe that empathy and moral authority can succeed where bombs and sanctions have failed? Or do you think the old empires will crush this hope before it can grow? Your answer matters, because history is not only written in palaces and parliaments, it is written in conversations, in shared beliefs, in movements that start small and grow unstoppable. If you believe Africa deserves recognition as a global peacemaker, write in the comments, "Africa the Peacemaker." If you think Traoré's success proves the world is ready for new voices, share this video. And if you want to support African leaders who choose healing over domination, subscribe and stay with us. Because this story is not ending. It is only beginning. The bullets have been fired, the peace has been signed, and the future hangs in the balance. But one truth is already permanent. The world has seen Africa lead, and it can never unsee it. June 2025. Impossible mission. Historic breakthrough. Assassination attempt. Homecoming triumph. Global recognition. One leader. Infinite courage. And a continent that refused to remain silent. The Middle East is quieter. Africa is rising. The world is watching. And the future is African.